Hello, my name is Stephen Janis. I'm reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore. In a city plagued with entrenched poverty and economic segregation, doling out tax breaks to wealthy developers may seem like a counterintuitive idea. But that is precisely what City Hall has championed over the past 2 decades to stimulate growth in Baltimore. And the numbers are huge. Recently, the City Council approved a $660 million break for Under Armour CEO Kevin Plank to build out Port Covington in southeast Baltimore. But just 2 years ago, another developer, Michael Beatty, was awarded $106 million incentive to build Harbor East, the home to energy giant Exelon. And all of these deals come with a price. Future tax revenues for services like school and healthcare are pocketed by developers. And the projects are clustered in already wealthy areas, which aren't burdened with property taxes that are the highest in the state. But our next guest says these subsidies not only exacerbate poverty, they calcify many of the litany of social ills which afflict Baltimore along stark racial lines. Lawrence Brown is an assistant professor at Morgan State University School of Community Health and Policy. He has studied the impact of tax breaks on the community in depth and is here to share his insights. Professor Brown, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, one thing I want to ask you as a person who's really studied this debate always comes up. We have a multitude of tax breaks, TIFs, pilots, but in the most recent one, Port Covington, $660 million, the developers argue, well, this isn't a tax break. This is something to help me with infrastructure. What do you say to that argument that a TIF, which is a tax increment fund, which basically lets them put their real estate taxes back to the property, is that a tax break? Is it a subsidy for developers?
Well, in many ways, technically it's not, but there is a tax break associated with Port Covington, and that's the $760.4 million in tax breaks that they did receive, $330 million or so from the enterprise tax zone and about $415 million or so from the brownfield rehabilitation tax credits. So there were significant tax breaks attached to the Port Covington TIF. And the thing is, that $760.4 million, that would be basically given to them over a 10-year period. So we're losing $70 million roughly every year in this deal. Now, the TIF itself, I wouldn't technically classify it as a tax break, but what I would say is they're gonna have to build schools, they're gonna have to build a fire station, they're gonna have to build a police station, they're gonna have to build recreation centers. So at that point, when they start building public facilities that taxpayers are gonna have to pay for in Port Covington, then it becomes a subsidy, essentially. Right. Because we're paying for them to have those services in that neighborhood.
Because they own all of it, basically, in the end.
They'll own it, but their taxes will be diverted. And that's what I would call it, a tax diversion.
Interesting. And, you know, and one thing, and I don't know, one of the major prices to the city is that none of that money, none of the normal money they would be paying in property taxes will be going to city coffers, right? So it'll be up to poorer residents to subsidize. What impact does it have on the city in terms of social inequity?
Well, I mean, we already spend twice as much on policing and prosecution than we do on health, housing, arts, and parks combined. So essentially, we're already spending twice as much on social control than we do on supporting life. And so I think, you know, it exacerbates that phenomenon where we're going to be supporting wealthier, whiter communities at the expense of lower income Black communities in our city. And I think that will have a tremendous impact over time negatively. We know that we're in the midst of a lead poison crisis. We're in a crisis of homicides and people really trying to get by. We have folks that are having water shutoffs. We're having, we're second in the nation in terms of rental evictions, second to Detroit, fourth in the nation in 2015 in terms of foreclosures. So we have a housing instability crisis, a crisis of really faith in the system, with the DOJ report coming out talking about the way police have mistreated and abused citizens in this city. You know, at a moment of crisis, to sort of give the subsidy to a billionaire in Port Covington, it really flies in the face of reason, and we're gonna pay the price.
Now, the developer argues, and Kevin Plank and Sagamore Development made some pretty slick commercials, and they argue that, well, we're gonna bring tons of jobs. Let's take a look at one of their videos, and let's talk about it after we watch it.
We will create jobs and new homes, connecting more of Baltimore to the waterfront and building a safe place for our kids to play. We will build on our city's hardworking heritage and channel our innovative spirit. Baltimore is resilient, and we've never been stronger. We will build it together.
Okay, so that is a pretty compelling sort of, you know, we're going to help everyone, everyone's inclusive, we're going to bring jobs to the city. What do you say to that argument? Well, we're going to bring jobs and development. This is the only way we can do it.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at the people who planned this deal, and look at the market analysis, particularly, it was produced by a company called Battelle, if I'm not mistaken. And you look at the key informants, you look at the folks at the city who wrote that report. 11 white men were either the key informants or the people that sort of informed the city about what was going on in terms of the market. And so the lack of inclusion is at the outset, and I think that's an important point. Now, to the video, you look at that and you see primarily nothing but black faces, even though, again, this was a deal that wasn't put together with lower income black voices involved in that market analysis. So I think, you know, there's a disjuncture that I see, you know, the sort of putting forth of black culture and black faces to sort of make it seem as though this project will be inclusive when in fact it'll be anything but.
And then one of the things you talked about, you write a lot about this, is about affordable housing problem in the city and how it exacerbates many of the problems you write about, which is lead poisoning. But there's really very little inclusionary housing included in this. Can you talk a little bit about that and what effect that has, not just on, you know, fairness, but some of the health outcomes and some of the policing problems, some of the things you study?
Well, let's talk about what's not included in this. Number one, there's no guarantee that our schools will be held harmless. And that's a tremendous impact over the past 2 years because of the TIF that we gave to Michael Beatty. We lost $50 million to our public schools. Right. So let's put that in the bucket. Now in the second bucket, you look at our housing issue, our housing crisis that I mentioned earlier in terms of housing instability, because housing is so unaffordable here in Baltimore. You look at the fact that, first of all, our median annual household income in Baltimore City is roughly $42,000 a year. Right. But the white AMI, the annual median income, is $60,000. The black AMI in our city is actually $33,000. So the median income in Baltimore for black people is so low at $33,000, it's very difficult, I think, to sort of create the type of affordable housing for people that are low income in this city without paying real special attention to the sort of AMI that you need to go to make that happen. Now, what Sagamore did is basically—
They're using the county AMI, right?
They used the regional AMI. Right, exactly. Regional. They used the regional AMI, which for a family of four—
AMI means
annual median income,
right,
or annual median household income.
Right. And they use it for the county, not the city.
Yeah, they didn't use the cities, but you know, I believe at 80% AMI, you're talking $60,000. So when they say, well, it's going to be affordable at 80% AMI, that's the only people who make $60,000 or more. If they say, well, it's affordable to 50% AMI, that's around 45, 50. That's still cutting off at least half of our city residents, and it's definitely cutting off a large percentage of our black residents. So this notion of affordable housing, it relies on them receiving low-income housing tax credits. It relies on the city providing housing or housing choice vouchers or project vouchers. There are all these loopholes and buyouts and off-site things that they can do to lower that 20% that they said they were going to provide for affordable housing.
Now, you know, we studied Harbor Point, which is a previous TIF. Only 20% of the jobs go to city residents, and a lot of them seem like security and not really high paying. Do these developers are they really going to deliver jobs that are going to transform people's lives like they're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, when you say 20%, we're giving them $100 million, $107 million was what we gave to Michael Beatty, which is going to cost us $250 million once you add in the interest and fees. But to only get 20% of the jobs, you know, is laughable. With Port Covington, Sagamore, the deal they struck will only get 30% of those jobs. So it's really ridiculous on the face of it that we receive 20%, 30% of the jobs, even though we're putting up the capital to help finance these multi-million and billionaires. So you have that. Now the question is, well, will this actually produce the jobs that are promised? Well, you look at EBDI, which received a $78 million TIF from the city back in 2007 or 8. And they said, hey, we're gonna produce 8,000 jobs for our biotech park that we're gonna build here. We're gonna have 5 biotech park buildings. We're gonna have a third of our jobs for low income folks, a third for regular folks, and then we're gonna have for highly professional, another third of those jobs allocated. Well, it's 15 years later, after the project started in 2001, how many jobs have they created? Only 759 or so, according to the Daily Record reporter Melody Simmons. And so you have this sort of situation. They promised 8,000, but we only got 759. And there's no punishment, there's no clawback provision. There's nothing to say that when they promised, in this case with Sagamore, 25,000, 35,000, what if they only end up producing 6,000? Yeah. And what's going to be the punishment for that? You know, what's going to be, are there any provisions that are going to, you know, make sure that the citizens of the city who are putting up so much funds are going to be made whole? You know, no, that's not going to happen. So I think that's the type of thing that our city council and our mayor failed. They failed to ensure racial and economic equity when it came to the Port Covington TIF.
Now, one of the arguments, one of the big debates about these TIFs, because there's been more of them, as you point out, EBDI, East Baltimore Development, Harbor Point, has been where they're located. And in terms of being not evenly distributed throughout the city, throughout low-income neighborhoods, mostly concentrated in already wealthy neighborhoods. And you did this fascinating graph where you showed this sort of L that showed where most of the TIFs went. Can you talk a little bit about that, explain what it means?
Absolutely. Well, you know, demographically, our city is very hyper-segregated in terms of race. Sociologist Douglas Massey at Princeton University came up with this fabulous research that helps illustrate this. And he wrote the book American Apartheid with his co-author Nancy Denton a couple of decades ago. But since then, he and another co-author, Jonathan Tenen, they created a scheme to sort of classify how hyper-segregated cities are in America. Baltimore ends up being in the top 8 hyper-segregated cities in the entire United States, along with other cities like Chicago, Flint, Detroit, Birmingham, St. Louis, outside of which is Ferguson, Cleveland, and Chicago. And so many of these cities, you have lots of racial conflict, lots of uprisings that have taken place, a lead poison crisis in Flint, which we should also have here in Baltimore and in a place like Cleveland. You know, these are cities that are on the edge and that are having real crises in terms of, and catastrophes even, right now. And hypersegregation is at the root of that because you're creating 2 different types of communities in your city. In white communities, you're creating structural advantages, which allows resources and access to goods and services to flow easily into those communities, whereas in redline, disinvested black communities, you're creating really sort of capital deserts where people don't have resources, they don't have access. And so my thesis around the white L is what I call it. And if you look at the racial dot map by Dustin Cooper at the University of Virginia, you can see that there's where the white population lives in the center of a city of Baltimore, coming down roughly from York Road, just south of Towson, where you have Roland Park, Guilford, Homeland. Then you move down to Mount Vernon, Charles Village, Mount Belvedere, those communities. Then downtown, then you head east along Pratt Street to Canton. You have Harbor Point, Harbor East, Fells Point, all these communities, Federal Hill. And so you have this white L where the majority of our white residents are clustered, whereas in the outlying areas in East and West Baltimore, primarily where our black residents live. And so I call that the black butterfly. But you can see on that TIF map, the allocation of TIFs in Baltimore have either been clustered tightly in the white L, or they've been given to white-owned institutions like Johns Hopkins, or in the terms of, you look at the TIF at Westport, which was owned by Patrick Turner, it's now owned by Kevin Plank. And so he owns 2 of those at Westport and also, of course, Port Covington. The only major black TIF, or TIF in a black neighborhood, there's been 2, one Frankfurt Estates, which is more of a residential area, and then of course Mondawmin Mall, which was about $17.5 million. Really the best, most equitable TIF that the city's ever done. We just never duplicated it.
Right, and there is Poppleton, maybe. We'll see what happens with that. That could be, but that's
well,
the first
that's with the University of Baltimore.
Right,
I mean, University of Maryland.
Sorry, I should explain. University of Maryland. Biotech Park, which a big chunk of that went to a private company to build out office space.
Exactly. So the inequity of know having it in the L or with these historically segregating universities.
So last question. We had the uprising. Poverty in Baltimore became like a national story, a tale of 2 cities, all the cliches, but it's real. And yet, it seems like we're upping the game on creating those inequities and making them worse. What What does it say about the psyche of the city that we're still giving out huge tax breaks even when we know that these structural poverty problems are causing so much social stress? What does it say about Baltimore?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to say is that poverty is really not this static construct that we make it out to be. Poverty is a process. The reason why we have so much poverty in Baltimore is because of a litany of policies and practices, processes that we've put in place that extract wealth from black communities: redlining, subpriming, predatory financial lending institutions like check cashing and payday lending facilities that we have in black communities. We have landlords that are slumlords that extract rents at higher prices than really should be legally allowed. And so what you have is really a situation where we're creating neighborhoods where wealth is extracted. We create poverty. We create and reinforce poverty with all the housing instability, the water shutoffs for $250 in the past, and now they've upped it maybe to $350 or $750, but still a low amount where you could lose your home to a tax lien. That creates poverty. The rental eviction, $7,000 a year, that creates poverty. The foreclosures, the massive number that we have here in Baltimore every year, especially after the foreclosure crisis, that creates poverty. So poverty is a process. And what we miss here in Baltimore is the fact that redlining is one side of the coin, greenlining is the other side of the coin. And what we did with Port Covington and Kevin Plank, we created a green line around Port Covington, and we gave them all the resources that a billionaire could ever want to create a beautiful community at the red line community's expense. So redlining lives, redlining is persisting, and we are continuing to sort of give structural advantage to the green line communities and give structural disadvantage to the red line communities. And that's the story, unfortunately, that's been true in Baltimore for decade after decade after decade.
Well, Professor Brown, we really appreciate it. Thank you, and we'll keep talking to you about your research and what you're doing going forward. Okay, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
My name is Stephen Janis. I'm a reporter for the Real News Network in Baltimore.